Welcome to Caribbean Focus. Caribbean Focus is the community voice of the Caribbean Research Center at Medgar Evers College, the weekly radio program highlighting Caribbean educational, cultural, and social affairs airs on WNYE 91.5 FM and streaming live on Facebook at Caribbean Focus CF. I am your host, Hermina Marcellin, and it is a pleasure to have with us Dr. Ken Irish Bramble, born in Marigot, St. Martin. Dr. Irish Bramble is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Medgar Evers College and a former research fellow at the Caribbean Welcome, Dr. Irish Bramble to Caribbean Focus.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Your video paused there, so I missed a tad bit of that pitch, but thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
My apologies. Technology, right?
Can't
live with it, can't live
That's
without
right.
it. I want to begin with your newly appointed position as the executive director of the Caribbean Research Center, which was spearheaded by your father, the late, great Dr. George Irish. How important is it to you in continuing your father's legacy?
Well, it certainly is an honor. I've often joked that he leaves big shoes for those of us who come behind to try to fill. Dr. Irish certainly did have a huge impact while he was the executive director of the Caribbean Research Center over a 2-decade period. And he took the center from what one might say was relative obscurity, and really was in its early stages when he took it over. And built it into an institution that has had broad community impact, intellectual impact on the intellectual community, and impact throughout the region. So the opportunity to step in and follow up some of the work that he started certainly is an honor. And a huge challenge at the same time. So thank you.
And as you mentioned, it is a huge challenge. And as the new executive director of the Caribbean Research Center, what are your plans for the center?
Well, we're still in the early stages at this point. One of the things that we're working on right now is just restructuring our physical space. As you may know, we had to move from our original location to a slightly smaller space. And our reading room was temporarily closed to the public. So one of the things that we're working on right now is to reopen the reading room and to provide researchers and members of the community access to our special collections. We're also getting back into the business of doing more community outreach. So in this upcoming year, we are doing some outreach to a small business community in New York City. We're undertaking a couple of research projects covering a wide range of things from environmental issues here in New York City and in some of the immigrant communities, some other issues related directly to the immigrant population and challenges that they're facing. We've laid back a little bit in terms of some of the work in Central America, but we are partnering with the Southern Diaspora entity, which has been our partner in Central and South America. So we are working with them as well, although I'm not sure that that's going to be the central focus for the first year. We're also sponsoring, as I said, research across a really a wide range of issues, including access to essential resources. We're doing a project looking at food deserts and healthcare access within the community. We're also, one of the things that I think is a little different in terms of following on from Dr. Irish's legacy is, we're trying to modernize the center. So a lot of our archives, for example, we're working on digitalizing them and making them accessible to a wider spectrum of people who may have interest in some of those documents and items. And restructuring our online presence and things like that. So we do want the Caribbean Research Center, people hear the Caribbean Research Center and they think we're all heavy academics. But as you well know, the Caribbean Research Center covers a wide range of activities and interests. Everything from, at one point in time, we ran after school programs. So we're doing a lot of that this year. Not after school programs in the traditional sense, but this year our focus is on trying to build out experiential learning. So this year we are partnering with other academic departments within the college and beyond to try to give and create pathways for young people to get into careers that they may not have even thought of. It's not even just a question of whether or not they have access to it. In some senses, it's a question of have they even considered that this might be an option. And so we're trying through our experiential learning programs to take young people and say, well, here's some exposure and some experience in these fields that you may want to consider a career in, whether they do or not, of course, is for time to tell.
You just mentioned, and as you mentioned, that the Caribbean focus, it falls under the umbrella of the Caribbean Research Center. How would your prospective plans for the center affect existing programs like Caribbean Focus?
They get bigger and broader. Everything bigger and better. So yeah, Caribbean Focus is important. One of the hidden gems, I think, and one of my goals is to make it less hidden, to expand, your viewership. And as you and I have actually discussed, sort of elevating it to a full podcast setup. Perhaps increasing the length or the variety of programming. I'd also love to use Caribbean Focus as part of our experiential learning program as well. So one of my goals is to get a young person or two who might have some interest in broadcasting or production involved in the Caribbean Focus program. Also, as we build out our internet presence, our website, and so on, is to broadcast Caribbean Focus and other programs similar to it to a broader audience. So nowhere but up for Caribbean Focus. Caribbean Research Center continues to be very much committed to the work that you are doing and supporting it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Irish. And I plan on looking forward to this continuous growth. I look forward to that. You are also the editor of Wada Bagi, a journal for the Caribbean and its diasporas, and also served as the editor of the Caribbean Research Center's new Visions newsletter. May you tell us a little bit more about Wadabagi? What does it mean? And how does it connect, or rather symbolize, the Caribbean and its global diaspora?
Okay, well, let's start with the Wadabagi. So Wadabagi is actually something many Caribbean people are familiar with, especially those who live in coastal areas. It's in essence a conch shell. And within the context of Caribbean history, Caribbean resistance and Caribbean identity, the conch shell played a crucial role. So the conch shell was often, these days we associate it with Juve and Carnival and someone, blowing it almost as a musical instrument, but it served a real community purpose for communication, right? In a time when people of African ancestry could not openly communicate and share information over time. And so a lot of people know the history of using drums to communicate, but the Wadabagi was also one of those instrumental pieces in that history. And so we named the journal after the Wadabagi because, again, this is a journal that is dedicated not just to the study of the Caribbean, the regional Caribbean, but the Caribbean and its diasporas, right? And so the beauty of the conch shell is you can blow it and that sound will carry over a very long distance. So the Wadabagi, we're now in our 19th volume of production, and our focus is obviously on the Caribbean and its diasporas, all aspects of the Caribbean and its diasporas, whether it's politics, economics, cultural. We do regular reviews of literature out of the various presses, all looking at the Caribbean experience. Our next issue, for example, is looking at COVID-19 and its impact on various Caribbean communities or responses to the COVID-19 experience, pandemic experience for a lot of Caribbean immigrant communities. New Visions is actually the third, or was the third, of our newsletters. So to back up just a little bit, so one of the things that the Caribbean Research Center does is that through our partnership with the Caribbean Diaspora Press Incorporated, which is a semi-independent entity, we're one of the few publishing houses that focuses exclusively on Caribbean American, Caribbean American and Caribbean diasporic issues and authors. And part of that goal too is also to provide, we have an academic element to our mission, right? And when I say academic, I'm speaking both internally within the college, but also broader. So one of our missions really is to give opportunities to up and coming scholars, writers, artists, to give them access to a publishing house that is supportive of the types of work that they do. So quite often, I'll give you an example. We published a few years ago some oral histories of the Garinagu people, right? And so this is a very niche, conversation that, a author who has done, or a researcher has done tremendous amounts of work and got this information, and may find that if they go to one of the larger publishing houses, that they don't appreciate the importance and the significance of that work. And this is, why Wadabagi exists, that we understand precisely why that is important. We understand the significance of that. And it is our mission to support the publisher, the writers and authors of these works in terms of getting their work out there into the infosphere.
I'm not wanting to
No, go right ahead.
I am interjected, right? I just wanted to, even on that note, add with Dr. Irish, your father, this high regard for the Garifuna, and which you mentioned it being a conch shell and it deriving from the Garifuna name for conch shell. So it all ties in, with this immerse interest in the Garifuna culture and people, I should say.
Yes, I think the Garifuna story is certainly a story that, well, first of all, it's an inherently Caribbean story. They are inherently Caribbean people, and as you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, in the dominant narrative, the histories of indigenous people sort of get, pushed to the side, and the stories of the Black Caribs and Garinagu sort of just gets a footnote, and so on. And my father was fond of a phrase which he borrowed from Dr. Rex Nettleford, in which he says, it speaks to the importance of documenting your own history, right? Because if you don't tell your own history, then who do you think will? So our interest in unique elements of Caribbean history, Caribbean culture, Caribbean identity, is set in stone, and the Garinagu just happened to be one such group who, and the history of them. I mean, I don't want to change the theme of our conversation, but to talking about Garinagu or Garifuna history, but their story has literally been a story of resisting being obliterated, resisting being wiped out, resisting being entirely assimilated into a larger narrative. So their struggle and their mission as a people matches perfectly with the struggle and the mission of the Caribbean Research Center. Is like, you want to make sure that your story is told. You want to make sure that people understand your place and your unique identity. And we too want to preserve it. We want to assist you in preserving it. And for a long time, the Garinagu have relied on sort of oral history in order to keep their story alive. Well, we all know oral history is great. That's fantastic. But it has its limits and its weaknesses. And so we at the Caribbean Diaspora Press are happy that we were able to, and proud of what we have been able to do in terms of documenting that history and that story, so that it's preserved for future generations, right? So that we don't just have to rely on the oral history.
Your ability to tie into and not stray from the theme and stay in focus really speaks to you as a professor, which leads us to our next discussion. Your educational background includes a BA in political science from the City University of New York, MA in comparative politics from New York University, an MA in secondary education from Pace University, and a PhD in comparative politics from NYU. May you please share with our listening and viewing audience your reasons for pursuing political science as a field of study?
Well, that's an interesting story, and I don't think we have enough time for me to actually for me to explain how I ended up there. But I was always an outspoken young man, I guess, and always interested in issues of justice and identity and power. My early ambitions, interestingly enough, were so as a teenager growing up, I got a little taste of of what it was like to represent members of your community and in larger settings. So I was a member of the National Youth Council in Montserrat, which is where I grew up, and a member of the Caribbean Federation of Youth, and so on, and had the opportunity to travel and present to a wide range of bodies, international bodies. So one of my early ambitions was actually to become a diplomat. You know, I figured this is a great lifestyle. They're gonna, you know, fly me around and put me up in a hotel and pay me, you know, to in essence talk about things that were important to me. And also, as is the case, I suppose, with many young people coming up who get an interest in those types of topics, you know, I had a little radical revolutionary element to myself as well. I came to the United States to study and to go to college, and political science and international relations actually was actually my original focus for the reasons that I just explained. And so I actually went into the CUNY BA program to study international relations and international law. Yeah, for like I said, we don't have enough time for me to actually get into the full details of it, and I'm not sure that you want to hear the whole story, but I did eventually switch from international relations to comparative politics. And as I progressed through my education, ended up specializing in a very niche element of comparative politics, which some of us call contentious politics, meaning that I became interested in studying not so much just, you know, not the electoral politics, not the normal everyday functioning of politics, but more so what happens when the politics falls apart and we end up in situations of civil wars, revolutions, and things of that nature, coups and so on. So my study ended up being really around political violence and the use of political violence in different communities.
Which actually, some of your publications include that very idea and research, titled Bricks, Ballots, and Bullets, Political and Communal Violence in Jamaica, Retrieving the American Past, a supplementary reading. I would like to know a little bit more about that. And Violence and Power, a collection of essays. Please, may you share briefly some of the central ideas presented in your research?
Okay. I guess I'll start with Bricks, Ballots, and Bullets, since you mentioned it first. So Bricks, Ballots, and Bullets was actually produced out of my dissertation. And so in my dissertation, you know, my chairperson, I got to give him got to give Chris a shout out. Chris, what's up? So my advisor, Professor Chris Mitchell at NYU, you know, as I was putting together this wonderful dissertation proposal, yeah, right. You know, he said to me, you know, there's a question that I've never understood. And I said, well, what is it? And he says, I don't understand all of this violence in Jamaica. You know, he says, you know, I like to go to Jamaica on vacation, and I'm always reading about all of this violence. Like, why does it exist? And so we got into a conversation about the roots of much of the organized violence in Jamaica, and that conversation ended up, you know, transforming itself into a revised dissertation proposal and thus my dissertation topic. So the dissertation version of the publication is called Stemming the Tide. And I use that terminology because the curious question about violence in Jamaica was not so much how the violence sort of rose, but Jamaica, by the time we got to the 1980s, looked like it was, on the verge of just outright civil war and possibly, political collapse. But it was very clear when you look at the data, or if you even had the conversations with people on the ground, that coming out of the 80s, there was a shift, right? So there was less conversation about the conflict being between, the two dominant political parties. And it just became, or appeared to just become, violence, right? A different form of violence. And so the question that I was really trying to address is, well, why did the political violence stop? Because those things, that's not the normal pattern. Like you don't have two warring political parties going at each other, and then all of a sudden they decide like they're just done. And Jamaican politics is certainly still very contentious, even today. But so my work focused on what factors came into play to change the violence as it existed on the ground in Jamaica from being inherently about electoral politics and becoming more about other factors. So the development of the garrisons, the introduction of or the growth of the drug trade in terms of its impact on violence, and other economic factors which made it important that the political leaders themselves actually started pulling back from actively engaging in and supporting the violence. I'm sorry, what were the other two? Retrieving the American past.
And even before we move on to violence, even before we move on to violence and power, as you were discussing these different factors in the previous publication, at any point was psychoanalysis hinted there in your research?
No, so there wasn't a psychological piece, although I think there's room for that study too, right? Something that certainly should be done. What the impact of what the impact of all this violence that has come to dominate much of the Jamaican story, like what that impact has had on the Jamaican people on a larger scale. I'm not sure that I'm the one who's qualified to to lead that particular enterprise, but surely it is something that should be done, and I suspect is being done on the ground by. One of the things that has also changed in this time period was the growth of a civil society. So so civic organizations that actually got involved in trying to address some of these issues, right? So the rise of social workers and intervention services and so on, and the support that they got for actually going out and dealing with it on a human level and grassroots level. So I guess my answer to your question is no, I have not done the psychological piece, but I certainly do think it's important.
And Violence and Power, a collection of essays?
So Violence and Power is another interesting piece, and I had a series of shorter papers which I had written but not published, with the exception of two of them. Two of them had been previously published elsewhere. And I thought it was important maybe it was just my ego talking, but I thought it was important that some of these conversations be, again, added to the infosphere rather than sitting on a hard drive somewhere. And I did something odd with those. So, it's certainly not the first person to have taken shorter works and put them together into a collection. One of the things that I did with that is that I actually published them in their original form. So I didn't go back, I didn't edit, I didn't, beyond copy editing, I didn't, change the ideas. And so even though I published it later, it was actually reflective of my thinking at least a decade earlier than when it was published. And it's an interesting collection, I think, in that it covers a wide range of topics, all within the realm of my discipline. But there are pieces in there which are about political theory. There are others which are by far more concrete. And I think the only one that I think was changed in any way, other than from its original form, was there is a chapter from Bricks, Ballots, and Bullets that is included again in that text, but I was modified to include a more comparative analysis. So in that particular chapter, we compared the use of communal violence, or the existence of communal violence in Jamaica to communal violence in Southeast Asia.
Quite an interesting comparison. Thank you so much for this explanation. I would like to shift our conversation, if I may, to your service as an athletic trainer for Alfred E. Smith CTE High School, the New York City Department of Education, a founding coach of South Bronx United Soccer Club, and you also served as head coach for the Alfred E. Smith CTE High School Warriors. May you share with us briefly about your optimism and belief in youth athletics?
Okay, I think youth athletics is super important to developing our young people as we set them up to go out into the world. First of all, I think it's a great hook when you tie it to academic goals, right? So I think back to myself in high school, and I say, well, what made you get up every day and run off to high school and so on? Was it those wonderful, exciting teachers who were giving all of these great lessons, and while educators would like to think the answer was yes, of course, that certainly was not it in my case. In my case, it was, one of the big factors was, you went to school because after school you got to go play ball and you were on this team, and you're the head of, back in those days we had houses, right? So you're the head of the house, and so you have to go and do this and do that, and so on. So I think that's great. And one of the things that, so you mentioned South Bronx United, which was founded by Andrew So. He really deserves the credit for that vision and for that enterprise. And from the very beginning, there were two things which were unique about South Bronx United. So we were a travel team, and by travel team, travel teams are competitive teams. We compete with other private clubs across the country, and in some cases internationally. And this is a very competitive environment in which quite often parents pay thousands of dollars in order to get their children onto a travel team, because you're more likely get better training. You're more likely to have greater access to coaches. You're more likely to get noticed and therefore end up with a scholarship and so on. And so there's all of this prestige that goes along with membership on a travel team. And so what happened with South Bronx United is we were a travel team with no entry fees, right? And a travel team that was located in the South Bronx, one of the poorest districts in the entire country, right? So here we were trying to roll out teams. And we're talking about teams from, under 8. So we're talking about, Munchkin teams all the way up to my team, which was the U19 at the time. So under 19. And so, we were offering these students the same experience that our competitors, in the circuits that we played, literally were paying thousands of dollars in order to have their kids on and have exactly the same experience. Now, the trade-off for us was, so you weren't going to have to pay any fees. You weren't going to have to pay for your travel costs. You weren't going to have to pay for your uniform or any of that. So there were no expenses to our students because we assumed that our students couldn't afford it. And quite often that was exactly the case. But the trade-off for the student was that we had academic requirements, right? So students had to bring in their transcripts at the end of every marking period. They had to show us their attendance rates at school. We had tutoring programs after school and so on, right? And intervention services, right? And all of this was being done on a voluntary basis, right? So all of our coaches, our social workers, everyone was pretty much volunteering their time and their expertise into this enterprise. But the impact was huge, see, because these kids love soccer. They want, you can't imagine. My favorite story as to how much they love this is that one year there was, we were having a recruitment session. So we were having tryouts and there was a blizzard coming. And so I said, oh, come on, there's a blizzard. There's no way, right, that anyone is going to show up for this tryout. But of course, you've put the information out there. The information is being out. And this wasn't quite, we didn't quite have the network for distributing information that we do in 2022. So I said, no, you got to go down there because, God forbid 3 kids show up and they're down there freezing their behinds off, like you got to make sure you're there. And so I show up thinking I'm going to be there. I'm going to hang out for a few minutes. I'm going to tell the kids we're going to reschedule and whatever. And instead I show up and there are 30 kids standing out in the middle of a blizzard 30. Like this. Yes, 30. And I don't have anywhere near that number of slots, because we're just recruiting to fill, the slots of those of our athletes who had gone on to college and who had aged out and so on. And there's 30 of them. And I'm like, this is insane. And then so I asked them, like, what are you doing here? Can you not see that there's a blizzard? And they said, yes, coach, but we did not know that there was going to be another chance to try out. So we, and believe me, those young people stayed and played their hearts out. And, we sent out and ordered hot chocolate and to try and keep them as warm as we could and so on.
Well, this story definitely speaks to your commitment and your belief in the youth, in youth athletics, youth in general.
Well, youth in general, yes, but athletics is particularly important. And and since you touched on it, and it really is one of my passions, I'll just say this one last thing. I also think that youth athletics is one of the best arenas in which you can teach soft skills, right? So there's so much stuff that young people learn by engaging in athletics. They learn the discipline of showing up for practice, and showing up for events, being there on time. They learn discipline of how to conduct themselves. They learn anger management. They learn how to work together. They learn communication skills. They learn how to keep their ego in check. You know, they learn, like, you know, so how do you win? You know, when you win, do you go make fun of the other team? No, that you have to win, you know, with grace, and you have to lose with equal, you know. So yeah, I think you know, youth athletics for me is something that I'll always support in any way that I can, because it keeps a lot of kids out of trouble. It gives you a great opportunity for mentorship of young people. Like I said, I think it's a great avenue for teaching important soft skills that translate into life skills that they take with them forever. So yeah, that's one thing you can always count me in on.
With athletics,
Youth athletics anytime, yeah, any day.
As it refers to, and it
Yeah, just don't ask me to run anymore. I'm not good.
Well, speaking of run, I know you mentioned about being a diplomat. I wanted to actually briefly touch on your work as a community advocate, and even considering your field of study. Would you, or are you considering running for office? Are you in that running arena, that type of running?
No, and
maybe even at a
that's
local
an easy
level?
one to answer. The answer is no, I'm not running for anything.
There is no yes or no, you know.
You know, there's a hard no. I'm not running for
Okay.
anything. Not at this time. Yeah, I haven't even given it any
thought.
any serious thought. No. So.
You know what is actually happening now, and we're going to close off with this last question, and although we're a little over time, but we'll work around that. President Joe Biden has nominated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to serve as the next justice of the Supreme Court. Any thoughts on the confirmation hearing that is taking place?
You're really trying to get me in trouble now. So no thoughts other than I think she's highly qualified. I think it is important that we have diverse representation on the Supreme Court. And I would say now more than ever, but that's not true. We've always needed you know, diverse representation on the Supreme Court, and the absence of that has demonstrated itself throughout history, right? You know, whether Dred Scott to Citizens United, really. You go all the way, you find that, you know, this idea that the Supreme Court is the exclusive domain of white Anglo-Saxon men, you know, is something that must be broken. And I'm happy to see us get to a point where maybe by the next generation, people won't be so shocked and surprised by the idea of a Black man on the Supreme Court, or shocked by the idea of a Hispanic woman joining the Supreme Court, or a woman in general joining the Supreme Court, or much less a African American woman joining the court. In terms of the actual exchanges taking place during the hearing, I'll reserve comment.
Okay. Okay. And I'll continue. I'm sure you will as well continue to view the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I am looking forward to having you join me again on Caribbean Focus. Maybe you should write that down in your notes, working on more time, because we don't have enough time, and there's so
It's
much
already in
more
the
that
notes. Like I would like to, we'll talk about that off the air. I would like to see the program expanded in terms of, both the medium by which you are broadcasting, time and format, and so on. And yes, please invite me back prior to the Shirley Chisholm conference, which will be coming up in April. And I'll reach out to you later and give you all the details on that event, which we have rolling out. And we should have some other events rolling out as well for Caribbean Heritage Month, which is also coming up. So thank you for
that
having
sounds
me,
great.
and I look forward to our next visit.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking interview. All the best on your new position as the Executive Director of the Caribbean Research Center. Thank you again. I know your father is smiling down at you. A special thank you to the Department of Mass Communication. Thank you to my viewing and listening audience for tuning in. This has been Caribbean Focus. I am your host, Hermina Marcellin. Thanks for listening and watching. Be well.